Okay, so before I start, I need to remind you all that I will talk about a vague concept that probably will not help you in the game. Well, it might, but most likely not. If you hear about tricks and tips to help you in the game, you might be disappointed, but it could help you, still. This will talk more about a certain theory that I personally find very interesting and just fun to talk about. It's a trivial matter that rarely has its uses. Granted, there are parts of this theory that may end up being a vital strategy in the level. Whether you know about this concept or not wouldn't really make much of a difference in your playthroughs. Now, let's get started. Meat shielding, as you all know, is a key strategy in Battle Cats. You've pretty much learned this ever since, you look up a guide in how to beat EOC Moon 3. I don't really need to tell you how important meat shielding is anymore. When we talk about meat shields, the idea of your general meat shields are those units that are like those cheap 2 to 4 seconds cooldown units and they have short range. For example, the cat variants or the tank variants, or maybe units like Rover and Artist and so on. Obviously, they would need to be short range so that they can slip in under enemies' attack range so that they may be able to stall the enemy from advancing. If your meat shields have big range, then they wouldn't be able to stall the enemies perfectly as they will stand outside of the enemy's range. That would ruin the point, right? So then you probably would look at the title of this video and ask, then what the fuck is a ranged meat shield? Doesn't a meat shield with a range wouldn't work properly, like as you said earlier? Well, the answer might shock you. You're right. A ranged meat shield doesn't actually work properly, or at least they don't work like a normal meat shield. It's kinda hard to start with this, but basically the ranged meat shield theorem or theory or whatever has, it's been pretty interesting to me ever since Caxter made a post about it years ago in the Reddit. I would highly recommend for you to go check it out, give it a read, maybe now or even later after the video. I'll link the post in the description, of course. Now, the way ranged meat shield quote-unquote works is that it more or less take on the idea that normal meat shielding are not perfect, and enemies will eventually push, even if it is theoretically possible to perfectly stall the enemies. But even if you use like 5 meat shields and cat CPU, enemies will still eventually push, as if multiple meat shields die together at once in one attack, there's a pretty good chance that the enemy will advance. Now, here is where ranged meat shield comes to play. Like I've said, ranged meat shield indeed doesn't work like a normal meat shield. They are not intended to stall the enemies perfectly, instead they serve as like a backup for your meat shield. They're more like a safety net. First let me take some example units of ranged meat shields, namely Fungi Cat, Rope Jump, and the more extreme one, Rampage Cats. You've definitely barely seen anyone use these as meat shields, and well, it's because they're really unconventional. They don't contribute much in perfectly stalling enemies, and they're usually more costly, and they're just not that good as your traditional meat shield. There's also the fact that we have an extremely limited amount of choice for a ranged meat shield. Aside from the 3 I've mentioned earlier, there's really like nothing else that isn't terrible. The closest we've got are those 3, and the best we got is Fungi Cat's evolved form. So let's talk about Fungi. Fungi has 90 cost, 2 seconds cooldown, just like a normal meat shield, but a tiny bit pricier. Meat shields are usually around 100 to 150 range. Fungi, however, has 200. It's a very odd number for a meat shield. There's like quite nothing like Fungi in the game so far. Due to standing on an absurdly high range for a meat shield, Fungi may sometimes not work like other traditional meat shields. While other traditional meat shields try to slip under enemies' attack range to stall it, Fungi may sometimes instead hang around outside of the enemy's attack range, outside of their reach, so that they just, lounge around there without actually going under the enemy's attack range. Fungi also has a pretty long attack animation, so sometimes it may also target lower range peons and then just stand there for a couple of seconds. This gives Fungi a unique interaction with the enemy compared to how meat shields usually interact with the enemy. Like I said earlier, instead of trying to perfectly stall the enemy, it will instead just hang around outside of the boss enemy's attack range. It doesn't actually just block the enemies from advancing, it just stands there. If you're confused on how this even helps at all, or even just how this works in general, I won't blame you. But let's return back to my previous statement about how this whole thing works on the idea that your meat shielding aren't perfect. At least in a generic situation, your meat shieldings are most likely never perfect. Even CPU won't perfectly stall out the enemies. Now this is where ranged meat shield comes to play. In case where the enemy pushes and the next meat shield in line is far away, ranged meat shield presents itself as the next closest meat shield instead. being always ready in front of the enemy. Range Meatshield would give you enough time to stall the boss for your next Meatshield to fill in the gap and continue Meatshielding once more, decreasing the potential space loss. Range Meatshield, like I said earlier, is your safety net. I would hope you've caught up until this point. You're probably thinking right now, well, that actually doesn't sound too bad. Why is fungi such an irrelevant unit when it seems to be the only one to possess this trait very well? The one very obvious reason is because it's not just limited, it's very limited. It's an old limited collab unit, and for that cause, old players probably either forget about it or guide makers doesn't want to use it because it's super limited, and new players won't have them. And the other reason is because it may sound decent on paper, but in reality it's not that simple. For example, one of the problems is, like I mentioned earlier, the fact that range Meatshield are not traditional Meatshields. If you're going in a level where 3 Meatshields are recommended, you might not want to count fungi as your third Meatshield, because 3 Meatshields are recommended to stall the enemies as good as possible, but fungi doesn't actually work in a way where it would help on stalling the enemies perfectly. So it doesn't actually work that well as a third Meatshield. Instead, it might work better as a fourth Meatshield, and using fungi as a fourth Meatshield means that you would be taking up a space. And generally it's not really worth bringing fungi in a stage, usually there's a much better choice. Another one of the problem is the enemies themselves. Let's say again Fungi Cat, who has 200 range. For a range Meatshield to work properly, you'd want the Meatshield to outrange the boss, or at least the enemy that you want to stall. But there's a pretty small amount of boss enemies that are actually even under 200 range, like the Boar family or Berserkori. One of the most common enemy, Bun Bun, also stands at 200 range, so yeah, it doesn't really work that well. In the end, in a case-by-case scenario, it's very rare for you to actually want to bring fungi in the stage. There's usually better choices. Although, I would say range Meatshield works pretty well against like individual strong peons, for example the Otta variants, maybe Zangru, Shy Boy, and Gory variants, or maybe Steel variants, etc. In situations like these where you can't fully rely on procs, range Meatshield is pretty decent. Even then, range Meatshield also kinda works against like the Boar family, because he outranges all of the boars, but a lot of the times when you're against boars, you will rely more on proc units and abilities, so Meatshieldings aren't actually that important. It helps, but it's not that great. Well, that's the more specific case on fungi, so let's talk about the other range Meatshields that I've mentioned earlier. So let's move on to Jump Rope. Jump Rope is also far from being a conventional Meatshield. His true form, though, Noodles Cat, gains the Resist Metal ability, which actually makes him pretty decent. Although Noodles is kinda costly, his health is pretty good against metal, and the small crit chance also kinda helps against slightly weaker metal enemies. You might see Noodles being used in some places, and you might use Noodles yourself, but you might not realize this. But Noodles outranges every single common metal enemies except for Super Metal Hippo. Super Metal Hippo and Noodles both has the same range of 170. Every other metal, Noodles outrange. Noodles actually shows a pretty good example of a range Meatshield, which unfortunately on this case is specifically for metals only. But fortunately for his case, he actually works. Against the likes of Metal Steel and Metal Doges, Noodles works exactly what the Range Meatshield Theory's idle situation suggests. Outranging the enemy, having multiple stack of them that these things, and being able to be just a backup Meatshield rather than a normal Meatshield. With having a decent health against metal, low cooldown, and not horrible of a price, Noodles is a pretty good range Meatshield against metal enemies. There's really not that much to talk about, so let's move on to Rampage Cat. Rampage Cat is something else. He has the 2 seconds cooldown of a Meatshield and a whopping range of 330. Why is he barely used? 375 cost. Okay, to be fair, this isn't insanely crazy pricey, but it's definitely pretty pricey for something that needs to be spawned every 2 seconds to be effective. He has 11k health, which is actually not that bad at all. He could take like 2 hits from certain late game enemies, but a lot of times he just dies in one shot anyways. And dying in one shot for 375 cost is not pretty. It's just generally not worth bringing at all. Not to mention that Rampage Cat's gigantic range means that he doesn't really work that well against short range enemies. as the short-range enemies needs to push a total of 330 range to even reach Rampage Cat in the first place. That being said, all of this would have been the case if range Meatshield's uses are purely limited as extra layers of protections. But range Meatshields are more than just extra layers of protections, it's more than just a safety net. The range of these Meatshields are also helpful when trying to do certain strategies. They can help in a decent amount of other aspects, such as avoiding wave attacks, countering some LD enemies, as well as slightly luring enemies. The luring enemies aspect has much more examples into it, and I'll get into it in a bit. So first, let's talk about avoiding wave attacks. This doesn't really work in all wave stages, rather this works more in a stage where there is a mix of generally short-range waver and a pusher in one stage. The usage of range Meatshield can heavily minimize the chance of the waver actually landing a hit. Some examples of these stages are Labyrinth of Hades and all of its remakes, with the Cory variant as the waver and the Bun Bun variant as the pusher, or Ogre Island, with Berserk Cory as the waver and Islands as the pusher. Or maybe even Craze Moneko in Moon Stage, with her being the waver and the boar and the peons being the pusher. So how does this work? Well, think about this. Since you have a pusher in a stage, you're going to want to Meatshield. However, Meatshields will generally be the reason that a wave occurs in the first place, right? There's usually two reasons on why a wave occurs. One is because the pusher enemy didn't kill your Meatshields fast enough so that the waver managed to land a hit. This can be caused due to your Meatshields being tanky, or if the pusher got hit by a status effect or was knocked back. The second reason is because during the attack animation of the waver, your Meatshield happened to walk inside the waver's attack range and caused a wave. Even if the initial Meatshield that triggers their attack already died. Utilizing range Meatshield would negate the possibility of the second option to occur. If your Meatshield has higher range than the waver enemy, then the Meatshield would not move inside the waver's range at all, as it will stop on a farther range. This is why I said generally short range waver, as big range waver isn't really affected by this unless your Meatshield's range is insanely huge. As for countering LD or Omni Strike enemies, this is also a little bit limited in usages, but certainly not useless. One of the easiest examples are Beverly Hills Scoop's Tackies. Tacky would be more likely to hit your units if there are low range cats shielding in front, as it will target the units behind. But you need those Meatshields to protect yourself from the Arost, and that's where range Meatshield can hit two birds in one stone. Well, sorta. The idea is like this. Say if your Meatshields has a similar range than your ranged attackers, this would mean that they would stand on a similar position. And since they would stand on a similar position, that means that Tacky is forced to move even farther, and that would also mean that Tacky will miss your ranged attackers, although it would still hit oncoming units. This is obviously not perfect, as in this stage, Arost is a really hard pusher that needs more than just one Meatshield to defend against. So you're still gonna need walls to actually Meatshield your units, which actually kind of ruined the point. Another more effective example is Floor 35's Dolphina. Using the same concept, you can shield your attacker from the crazed fishes while making your attacker safe from Dolphina's attacks. However, the application here I'd say fits more onto the last category, which is about luring enemies closer. So let's talk about that instead. There's so many applications in this one, although the general idea is basically to lure some certain enemy so that your cats can hit them while still being able to Meatshield. This sounds confusing, I know, so maybe I should give some examples first. For example, let's take the Haunted One LDK. The enemy combination there is Miss Haka and Gravy. Well, a common strategy to tackle this stage is to infinitely knock Miss Haka back and not giving it a chance to burrow as you chip away Gravy. You're gonna want as much attackers as possible to hit and knock Miss Haka back before she burrows, and ranged Meatshields can help too. So the problem is this. You'd want to shield your rangers from Gravy, but you also want to hit Haka. However, the usage of short-range Meatshields, especially fast ones, would cause Haka to burrow before she even moves in front of Gravy, which means your non-LD units won't get the chance to attack her at the first place. However, if your Meatshield's range is big, then Haka will be forced to move in front of Gravy before she can trigger her burrow. This allows your attackers to hit Haka and allows you to shield Gravy at the same time. Hopefully you're starting to get the idea. This can be used in many situations, but mostly only against enemies that has high knockback count or low health. Like I've said earlier, Floor 35's Dolphina is one of the examples, because Dolphina has an insanely huge amount of knockback count. Using Ranged Meatshield allows you to shield the fishes as well as forcing Dolphina to fight closer to your ranged attackers, causing it to be more vulnerable to your attacks and getting knockback easier. Another example, let's just say using Noodles, and for example, King of Heroes. It also works pretty similarly. Not only as it works as a second layer of Meatshield, having Noodles also allows you to shield your units while pulling the metal enemies out from behind Gilgamesh, allowing it to get hit by your barrage of anti-metals.
Baku's Revenge stage is a really good example of an environment where ranged Meatshield works, where you'd want to Meatshield against the peons, like the Gories and the Shadow Boxers, but you also don't want to trigger Baku's attack. Ranged Meatshield really shows its potential here, as one Baku attack can really ruin your stack.
Earlier I said this mostly applies to easy to knockback enemies, but this isn't entirely true, as you can technically use it against more tanky enemies with using knockback status effect. Let's just put one example against a waiver, Berserkory. Berserkory has a really tanky health and only one knockback count. However, you can knock him back with Pirate Cat. This is already a pretty common strategy against some Berserkory stages, for example Ogre Island. But this also applies to other stages like Boiling Spring. You could use Ranged Meatshield to pull Berserkory out from behind JK Bunbun so that you can use Catly to knock him back. These are just a few examples. Using slow Meatshields can achieve a similar results on luring enemies, but we're focusing on Ranged Meatshields. The thing is, concept-wise, Ranged Meatshield works better than slow Meatshields, but the problem is Fungi is just okay at this job, and the second best thing we got for general Ranged Meatshield is Rampage Cat, and as we all know, Rampage Cat pretty fucking sucks. So yeah, part of what I'm trying to say is that the concept of Ranged Meatshield doesn't really suck, but the units we currently have that fills their roles are. If by chance Ponos were to give us a unit similar with Fungi Cat or Rampage Cat that doesn't drain your money as bad, then I think the Ranged Meatshield strategy could have an insanely bigger potential. But what if I told you that all these times of you playing the game, you might have been applying the Ranged Meatshield theory without actually realizing it? Yeah, so let's shift focus a little away from actual traditional Meatshields or the Ranged Meatshield that I mentioned earlier, and let's talk about attackers. Range stackable attackers, you know the ones, like Paris, Dragons, or even Jizzo. I'm sure you're familiar with these, and there's a good chance you've worked with these units before, or maybe like similar units like these. And if that's the case, then you've most likely actually had some experience with Ranged Meatshield Theory before. Well, how do you ask? It's pretty simple. These stackable ranged attackers, when stacked up, pretty much acts like a Ranged Meatshield. Yeah, that includes Dragons and Jizzo. There's been a decent amount of strategies that revolves around attackers being Meatshields. Some examples are Camera and Sanzo being kind of a ranged Meatshield in Trouble at the Mansion, Cyborg's Drama, etc. and Ogre Island no Meatshield strategy, pretty much all of your attackers shielding Bahamut in Lotso Lion, Camera in Craze Maneko, and even Dragons in Vulcanizer. These units are definitely not your everyday Meatshields, and they aren't even your traditional ranged Meatshield, yet they could work like a ranged Meatshield. These are what we call pseudo ranged Meatshield. Kakazer also mentions this in his Reddit post about how stackable ranged attackers could qualify as a pseudo-ranged Meatshield, as they give an extra layer of protection for every unit behind them. Obviously, they don't work like a theoretical good ranged Meatshield, as they generally have really high cost and are really high cooldown as a Meatshield. However, they are much more easier to be applied on in common stages, and since they mostly take the role of an attacker, that's again hitting 2 birds in 1 stone. Being a quote-unquote Meatshield just happens to be the side effect. If you want another clear example, I would refer you to a run of Jizzo soloing Ogre Island. The Ranged Meatshield theory applies very well here. Jizzo having a high spammability makes him both an attacker and a Meatshield at the same time, the Jizzo at the front protecting the Jizzo at the back, and due to having high range, they won't accidentally run into Berserkory's attacks like how I explained earlier. Basically, I would say pseudo-ranged Meatshield are the closest we got to a type of ranged Meatshield that is actually applicable to common usage scenario, which honestly isn't saying much.
So to wrap it up, I personally think ranged Meatshield is just a very interesting theory. So far it has its good uses, but the lack of available units that we have really limits on the potential that we can unlock in the game. I really wish this could have been so much more than what it is, even though it is pretty useful in a lot of stages and a lot of scenarios. But it could have been so much more if we have just certain units that actually match the criteria. So in the end, a lot of these are just impractical. And with that you might ask, well, if it's really that impractical, then why do you make a video about this? Okay, I've made a lot of videos about stupid impractical stuff. A lot of the videos that doesn't even really matter in the end, but it can matter, and I know some people appreciates these kind of stuff, and I don't want like these sort of stupid theories and stupid strategies that will really only touch on certain people gets lost in obscurity. I want this to live on. It's weird, I know, yeah, but I just want to.
I'm sure there's people who appreciate these sort of useless knowledge, and whether you're one of them or not, I hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time!